At 02:15 on August 7, 1944, Sergeant Robert Callahan crouched behind his 3-inch M5 gun just east of Mortain, France, listening to something massive moving through the fog. 26 years old, 11 months with the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, zero experience fighting blind. The Germans had committed 4 SS Panzer divisions to Operation Lüttich. Roughly 200 tanks were rolling toward 12 American guns that couldn't move. Company A of the 823rd had arrived at Mortain 3 days earlier with the 30th Infantry Division. Their M5 guns were towed weapons, 3 tons of steel that fired 76mm shells, effective range 2,100 yards, but you had to see the target, you had to aim. And on the morning of August 7th, visibility was 15 feet. The fog had rolled in after midnight, dense summer ground fog that turned the Norman countryside into a wall of gray. Callahan's gun crew had dug their weapon into position on the eastern approach to town. They'd built hasty earthworks, camouflaged the trails, stacked ammunition. Now they waited in conditions that made aiming impossible. The 823rd had fought at St. Lo 3 weeks earlier. They'd lost guns there, watched crews get overrun when German armor appeared through the hedgerows faster than anyone expected. Towed guns had one fatal weakness: you couldn't retreat under fire. Once you were in position, you stayed or you died. Battalion intelligence had warned them the night before. German tanks were massing east of Mortain, 4 divisions. 1st SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, 2nd SS Das Reich, 2nd Panzer, 116th Panzer. Hitler's counteroffensive to cut the American breakthrough and reach the coast at Avranches. The 30th Division held a 20-mile front with 3 infantry regiments. The 823rd had 12 guns dispersed among them. Company A near Mortain, Company B at St. Barthélemy, Company C in reserve. 12 towed guns against the largest German armored assault since D-Day. Callahan had studied the tactical problem all night. His M5 could penetrate a Panther's side armor at 1,500 yards, maybe the frontal armor at closer range if he got lucky, but that assumed he could see the target. Aim the gun, calculate deflection. The fog made all of that impossible. Radio traffic had gone quiet at 0100. Battalion headquarters had ordered radio silence to avoid giving away positions. Now Callahan heard only the sounds coming through the fog: diesel engines, tank treads on pavement, the distinct rattle of Panther road wheels. Maybe half a mile away, maybe closer. His gun crew waited. Loader, gunner, 2 ammunition handlers, 5 men total. They'd trained at Camp Hood in Texas with the assumption they'd see what they were shooting at. Nobody had trained them for this. The sound grew louder. Multiple engines now. A column. Panthers moved differently than American Shermans. Lower engine note, heavier sound. Callahan counted vehicles by ear. At least 6, probably more behind them in the fog. If you want to see how Callahan's crew solved the problem of fighting tanks they couldn't see, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Callahan. At 0243, the first German tank fired. Callahan saw the muzzle flash bloom orange through the fog 200 yards ahead. The shell screamed overhead and detonated somewhere behind the gun position. Then another flash. Another tank firing blind. And Callahan understood. If he could see their muzzle flashes, they could see his. The first crew to fire would die. But staying silent meant dying anyway. He had maybe 30 seconds to decide whether to gamble everything on shooting at fire he couldn't see. Callahan gave the order with a hand signal. His gunner traversed left toward where the muzzle flash had appeared. The loader slammed a high-explosive round into the breech. They had no armor-piercing shot loaded, no time to switch. Fire now or lose the position. The gun fired at 0245. The recoil drove the trails back 6 inches through the dirt. Callahan watched his own muzzle flash light up the fog like a spotlight. For 3 seconds, everything around the gun position was visible. Then, darkness again. He'd just told every German tank exactly where he was. 15 seconds passed. Then an explosion erupted through the fog ahead. Secondary detonation. Ammunition cooking off. His crew had hit something. They'd fired blind at a target they couldn't see and somehow connected. But now, the German tanks knew his position. Callahan counted to 10 and ordered his crew to displace the gun. 5 men grabbed the trails and heaved. They moved the M5 30 feet north, dug it in again, loaded armor piercing, waited. The Germans fired back, 3 tanks simultaneously. Their shells impacted where Callahan's gun had been 40 seconds earlier. The fog saved him. The Germans were shooting at memory, at where they'd seen his flash, not where he was now. Another German muzzle flash bloomed 400 yards east. Callahan's crew fired again. Another hit. The flash revealed the target for half a second. A Panther. Burning now. Crew bailing out into the fog. The loader was already ramming the next round home. This was the tactic. Fire at their flashes, displace immediately, fire again before they adjusted. It was insane. It was improvisation. It was the only option that didn't involve dying in place. Other guns from Company A joined the fight. Callahan heard them firing north and south of his position. Each muzzle flash created a beacon. Each beacon drew return fire. The fog magnified every sound, made it impossible to know how many German tanks were out there or how close they'd gotten. At 0300, a gun position 200 yards south took a direct hit. Callahan heard the impact, heard the ammunition explode, heard nothing after that. 1 gun down, 11 remaining. The German column had stopped advancing. Callahan could tell by the engine sounds. They'd gone stationary. The Panthers were maneuvering, trying to flank the American positions, trying to get angles on guns they couldn't see. Towed guns had no armor protection, just a thin gun shield that might stop small arms fire, but meant nothing against a 75mm tank round. Callahan's crew was completely exposed. If a Panther got within 300 yards and had a clear shot, the crew died. Simple mathematics. Another American gun fired, then another. The battle had become a light show in the fog. Orange flashes appearing, disappearing. Shells screaming invisible through the gray. Some found targets, most vanished into nothing. But each flash gave information. Each detonation told the gunners where to aim next. At 0320, Callahan saw movement through the fog. Shapes. Infantry. German Panzer grenadiers advancing on foot. They were probing for the gun positions, trying to locate them so the tanks could fire accurately. His ammunition handler had a Thompson submachine gun, the only defense they had against infantry. But firing it would reveal their position just as surely as firing the main gun. Callahan made another calculation. Let the infantry get close. Kill them quietly if possible. Stay hidden as long as possible. Or shoot now and accept the consequences. The Panzer Grenadiers were 60 feet away when Callahan made his decision. He couldn't let them get any closer. By 0330, the fog hadn't lifted, but Company A had destroyed at least 7 German tanks by firing at muzzle flashes, and the Germans had overrun 3 American gun positions. 8 guns left, and sunrise was still 3 hours away. The ammunition handler opened fire at 0332. The Thompson lit up the fog with muzzle flash. 3-round bursts. 5 German Panzer Grenadiers dropped in the first 6 seconds. The rest scattered into the gray. But the damage was done. Every German tank within 800 yards now knew exactly where Callahan's gun was positioned. Callahan ordered immediate displacement. The crew abandoned their fighting position and dragged the M5 40 yards northwest. They were still digging it in when the first German tank round hit their old position. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. The Panthers were concentrating fire on where the Thompson had fired from. By 0400, Company A had lost 5 guns total, almost half their strength, but they destroyed 9 confirmed German tanks. The exchange rate favored the Americans, barely. The problem was sustainability. The 823rd had started with 12 guns. 7 remained operational. The Germans had started with roughly 200 tanks. They could afford losses. The Americans couldn't. The fog began thinning slightly as dawn approached. Not enough to see clearly, just enough to make out shapes at 100 yards instead of 15 feet. This made everything worse. The German tanks could now maneuver with slightly more confidence. They were pushing forward again. At 0415, Callahan heard American tank engines approaching from the west. Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion. Reinforcements. They'd been held in reserve near Juvigny. Now they were moving up to support the gun line. But Shermans in fog against Panthers was mathematics that didn't favor the Americans. The Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. The Panther could kill a Sherman from any angle. The radio crackled. battalion headquarters ordering all surviving guns to hold their positions. The 30th Infantry Division was falling back to secondary defensive lines. Company A had to stay in place to cover the withdrawal. No retreat, no displacement. Just hold until the infantry got clear. Callahan checked his ammunition. 47 rounds remaining. Mixed armor-piercing and high explosive. At their current rate of fire, maybe 90 minutes of shooting. Dawn was at 0600. If they could hold until full daylight, American fighter bombers could intervene. Typhoons and Thunderbolts. But that was still 2 hours away. Another gun position took a direct hit at 0430. Callahan heard it explode, saw the flash even through the thinning fog. 6 guns left in Company A. The Germans were methodically destroying them, working north to south along the gun line, eliminating each position through concentrated fire. The tactical problem was now obvious. Callahan's crew could keep firing at muzzle flashes, keep scoring hits, but eventually a German tank would get close enough for a clear shot. The fog was lifting. Visibility was improving. That favored the Panthers. They had armor. They could take hits. The M5 gun crew couldn't. At 0445, Callahan saw what he'd been dreading. A Panther emerging through the fog, 300 yards directly ahead. Hull down behind a hedgerow, turret traversing, searching for targets. The German tank commander couldn't see Callahan's position yet, but he would in seconds. Callahan's gunner was already laying the sight. The loader had armor-piercing ready. They had 1 shot, maybe 2 if they were fast. The Panther's frontal armor was 80 millimeters thick at an angle. The M5 could penetrate that at 300 yards. Theoretically. Combat conditions were never theoretical. The German tank's turret stopped traversing. It was pointing almost directly at Callahan's position. The gunner inside had spotted something. Maybe the gun's silhouette, maybe movement. Callahan gave the order to fire. Both tanks shot simultaneously at 0447. The shells crossed in flight through the fog. The German shell hit the ground 6 feet in front of Callahan's gun shield. It skipped, ricocheted upward, passed over the barrel, and detonated 30 yards behind the position. Callahan's armor-piercing round punched through the Panther's mantlet and penetrated the turret. The German tank didn't explode. It just stopped. Turret frozen mid-traverse, smoke pouring from the commander's hatch. 10 tanks destroyed, 6 American guns remaining. The mathematics was getting worse. At 0500, the fog had thinned enough that Callahan could see 200 yards in most directions. This changed everything. The German tanks no longer needed to fire blind. They could identify targets, coordinate fire, maneuver with purpose. The advantage the fog had given the American gun crews was disappearing. The Shermans from the 743rd had engaged the German column further south. Callahan heard the fighting. Sherman guns had a higher pitched crack than the German 75mm. He heard multiple Sherman hits, then explosions. The Shermans were dying. Panthers at range could penetrate Sherman armor before the Shermans got close enough to return effective fire. Battalion radio reported the situation at 0515. 8 German tanks destroyed by Company A, 3 more destroyed by Company B at St. Barthélemy, 4 Shermans lost, 2 more damaged. The German advance had slowed but not stopped. The 2nd SS Panzer Division was pushing hard toward Mortain itself. If they took the town, they'd cut the road to Avranches. Everything the Americans had gained since D-Day would be threatened. Callahan's gun crew had fired 63 rounds since the battle started. They had 21 armor-piercing shells left. No high explosive remaining. Every shot from this point had to count, had to be against armor, had to penetrate. At 0530, American artillery began falling on the German positions. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion firing from positions west of town. 105mm howitzers. The shells came screaming overhead and detonated among the German tanks. Not enough to destroy Panthers, the armor was too thick, but enough to suppress the Panzer Grenadiers, enough to force the tanks to button up, enough to slow the advance. Callahan used the artillery barrage to reposition again. His crew dragged the M5 50 yards east, found better defilade behind a stone wall. They were running out of room to maneuver. The German tanks had pushed to within 400 yards of their position, much closer, and the M5 wouldn't have time to fire, displace, and fire again. Another American gun position was overrun at 0540. Callahan saw it happen. German infantry swarmed the position from 2 directions, while a Panther provided covering fire. The gun crew fought back with small arms, held for maybe 90 seconds, then silence. 5 guns left in Company A. The sun was rising now, not visible through the overcast, but the sky was getting lighter. Visibility improved to 400 yards, then 500. Callahan could now see the full scope of what they were facing. German tanks spread across half a mile of front, at least 30 Panthers and Panzer IVs visible, more behind them in the haze. The column stretched back toward the German lines like a steel snake. The tactical situation was clear. 5 American guns against 30-plus German tanks with infantry support. No retreat possible. Artillery support limited. Air support still 60 minutes away. The math said they should already be dead. At 05:55, Callahan spotted 3 Panthers moving to flank his position from the north. They were using the hedgerows for cover, advancing in bounds. Professional tactics. These weren't regular Wehrmacht. This was 2nd SS Das Reich, elite troops who'd fought since 1940. His crew had 3 options: engage the flanking tanks and expose themselves to frontal fire, stay focused on the front and die from the flank, or abandon the gun and run. Dawn broke at 0600. The fog lifted completely, and Callahan realized they'd been fighting in the wrong direction the entire time. When the fog lifted at 0600, Callahan saw the main German column had bypassed his position entirely. The 30 Panthers he'd been watching to the east were a screening force. The real attack had come through the valley 2 miles south. 2nd SS Panzer Division had punched through the American lines near Saint-Barthélemy and was already halfway to Avranches. Company A had been fighting a diversion, but the diversion had worked. The 5 remaining guns had tied down 30 German tanks for 4 hours, forced them to fight methodically, prevented them from reinforcing the main thrust. The tactical value wasn't in the tanks destroyed, it was in the tanks delayed. Radio traffic at 0605 confirmed what Callahan suspected. The main German column had broken through, but the 30th Infantry Division had held Hill 314 east of Mortain, the high ground, the observation post. As long as American forward observers controlled that hill, they could call artillery on any German movement toward Avranches. The breakthrough wasn't complete. The German tanks facing Callahan's position began withdrawing at 0615, not retreating, repositioning. They were pulling back to join the main effort. The screening force had accomplished its mission. Company A had accomplished its mission. Both sides had done what they needed to do. Callahan counted the cost. 5 guns lost from Company A, roughly 30 men killed or wounded, 12 more missing. For that price, they destroyed 11 confirmed German tanks, damaged at least 6 more, and most importantly, they'd held their section of the line for 4 hours during the most critical phase of the German attack. American fighter bombers arrived at 0620, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force. They came in low under the overcast, strafing runs on the German column. Rockets, 500-pound bombs. The Luftwaffe had almost no presence over Normandy by August 1944. The German tanks had no air cover, no defense except their own machine guns. Callahan watched the Thunderbolt put 2 rockets into a Panther at 0625. The tank exploded. Turret lifted 6 feet off the hull and crashed back down. Another Panther tried to escape through a hedgerow. A second Thunderbolt caught it with a bomb that detonated 5 yards short. The concussion flipped the 45-ton tank onto its side. The German withdrawal became a rout. Panthers and Panzer IVs abandoning their positions, racing east toward their own lines. Some made it, most didn't. The Thunderbolts hunted them through the Norman countryside for the next 2 hours. By 0800, the field in front of Callahan's position contained 17 destroyed German tanks, 11 from Company A's guns, 6 from airstrikes. Battalion headquarters ordered Company A to hold in place at 0830. No pursuit, no advance, just maintain the defensive line. The Germans still held Mortain itself. Hill 314 was surrounded, but not taken. The battle wasn't over. It had simply shifted to a different kind of fighting. Callahan's crew spent the next hour recovering equipment from destroyed gun positions. They found 3 M5 guns that could be salvaged, damaged, but repairable. They found ammunition scattered across 3 fields. They found bodies, American and German. The fog had hidden the true cost until daylight revealed everything. At 0900, Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Detmer arrived at Company A's position, battalion commander. He walked the gun line, counted the survivors, counted the wrecks, didn't say much, didn't need to. The evidence spoke clearly enough. By 0930, the situation was stabilizing. The German breakthrough had failed to reach Avranches. The American hold on Hill 314 meant German movement was still observable, still targetable. The counteroffensive was stalling. Hitler had gambled on surprise and speed. The fog had given him surprise, but 12 American guns and the 30th Infantry Division had denied him speed. The battle for Mortain would continue for 6 more days, but the critical moment had already passed. At 02:15 on August 7th, when Sergeant Robert Callahan first heard German tanks moving through the fog. The German offensive continued for 6 more days, but Operation Lüttich never recovered the momentum it lost on the morning of August 7th. The delay caused by Company A and the rest of the 30th Infantry Division gave Allied forces time to consolidate defensive positions and bring up reinforcements. By August 8th, American commanders understood the full scope of Hitler's counteroffensive. 4 Panzer divisions committed, roughly 300 tanks total. The objective was clear: cut through to Avranches, sever the American supply lines, trap the Third Army in Brittany. It was Germany's last chance to contain the Allied breakout from Normandy. But the plan required speed. The German columns needed to punch through American lines before Allied air power could intervene, before reinforcements arrived, before the defenders could organize coherent resistance. The fog had given them the surprise they needed. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion had taken away the speed. Hill 314 remained in American hands throughout the battle. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment held that position for 6 days while surrounded. 700 men cut off, supplied by parachute drops, directing artillery fire on German movements below. Over 300 became casualties, but they never surrendered the observation post. The strategic importance of that hill cannot be overstated. From its summit, American forward observers could see every German movement toward Avranches. Every column, every concentration of tanks. They called down artillery continuously. The Germans couldn't maneuver without being observed, couldn't advance without being targeted. By August 10th, the German attack had completely stalled. American reinforcements had arrived in strength. The 2nd Armored Division, elements of the 1st Infantry Division, additional tank destroyer battalions with self-propelled M10 guns. The balance of forces had shifted decisively against the Germans. Allied air power dominated the battlefield once the weather cleared. Typhoons from the Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force, Thunderbolts from the American 9th Air Force. They flew continuous sorties over the Mortain sector, destroyed German tanks caught in the open, attacked supply columns, made daylight movement suicidal for German armor. German tank losses mounted steadily. By August 13th, when Hitler finally authorized withdrawal, the 4 Panzer divisions had lost over 120 tanks, 2/3 of their committed armor. The Panthers and Panzer IVs that survived retreated east toward what would become the Falaise Pocket. The failure at Mortain had strategic consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. Hitler's insistence on counterattacking had pulled German armored reserves away from other sectors. The Canadian First Army advancing from the north faced weakened opposition. American forces pushing east from the south encountered reduced resistance. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army found themselves increasingly encircled. By late August, the encirclement was complete. The Falaise Pocket. German forces trapped between converging Allied armies. Tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks and vehicles. Most were destroyed or captured in the final week of August. The German army in Normandy ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Historians debate whether the Allies could have closed the Falaise Gap faster, whether more German forces could have been trapped. But there's no debate about Mortain's significance. If the German counteroffensive had succeeded, if they'd reached Avranches, the entire Allied campaign in France would have been jeopardized. The war might have lasted months longer. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Mortain. The citation noted extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. 11 guns lost, 37 men killed, 63 wounded, 14 tanks destroyed by towed guns firing blind in fog, and an entire German offensive delayed at the critical moment. Sergeant Robert Callahan survived the battle. He remained with the 823rd through the rest of the war. They converted to self-propelled M10 tank destroyers in November 1944, fought at the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine in March 1945, reached the Elbe River in April. The debate about towed tank destroyers had been ongoing since 1943. Army doctrine called for mobile, aggressive, tank-hunting units that could rapidly deploy to threatened sectors. The M10 self-propelled tank destroyer fulfilled that vision. Fast, armored, capable of keeping pace with armored divisions. The towed 3-inch M5 gun represented the opposite philosophy: static defense, dig in and wait. Many senior officers considered towed guns obsolete before they ever reached combat. General Bruce Clark called them death traps. General Maurice Rose refused to accept towed TD battalions in his division. The logic was simple. Modern armored warfare required mobility. A gun you couldn't move under fire was a gun that would be destroyed. Mortain proved the doctrine both right and wrong. Right in the sense that 5 guns were indeed destroyed because they couldn't retreat under fire. The crews had no escape once German tanks flanked their positions. Static weapons in a mobile battle. But wrong in the sense that those static weapons achieved their tactical objective. They delayed the German advance. They held terrain long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The M5 gun itself was a compromise weapon. 3-inch barrel taken from an anti-aircraft gun. Carriage borrowed from the 105mm howitzer. It fired a shell that could penetrate Panther armor at close range. Sometimes. The armor-piercing round had mixed reliability. Some rounds penetrated, some shattered on impact. Gunners never knew which they'd get until they fired. The gun weighed 3 tons, required a truck or half-track to tow it. Took 10 minutes to properly emplace, maybe 3 minutes if the crew was desperate. Once dug in, the M5 provided excellent firepower. But getting it into position and getting it out again under fire proved nearly impossible in practice. After Mortain, the Army accelerated conversion of all towed TD battalions to self-propelled units. The 823rd began receiving M10s in November 1944. Other battalions followed through early 1945. By the end of the war, almost no towed guns remained in frontline service. Mortain had been their last major engagement. The men who fought with towed guns developed specific skills, calculating firing angles without powered traverse, loading heavy ammunition by hand, digging positions in frozen ground or clay. These were artillery skills applied to direct fire combat, different from tank crews, different from self-propelled TD crews, a unique form of warfare that disappeared with the weapons themselves. Several members of Company A received individual decorations for actions at Mortain: Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts. The official records note acts of heroism, but provide few details. Men who stayed at their guns while being flanked, crews who fired until they ran out of ammunition, loaders who kept feeding rounds while under machine gun fire. The August 1944 after-action report from the 823rd provides the most detailed account. 10 pages describing the battle from a battalion perspective. Equipment losses, ammunition expenditure, casualty figures. The report notes that towed guns succeeded when they had infantry support and failed when isolated. It recommends better coordination with infantry units, better communication equipment, more training in night fighting. But the core recommendation is clear: convert to self-propelled as soon as possible. The report states that towed guns can hold defensive positions effectively, but cannot maneuver in fluid situations, cannot retreat under fire, cannot pursue. The weapon system had proven its limitations at Mortain, even while achieving tactical success. By 1945, the M5 gun existed primarily in training units and rear area defense. The few that remained in Europe served with rear echelon security forces. Some were transferred to French units. Some were scrapped. The weapon that had stopped 4 Panzer divisions at Mortain became a footnote in weapons development history. But the men who crewed those guns never forgot what they accomplished. 37 died, proving that old doctrine could still achieve results when applied correctly. When crews had courage. When commanders understood their weapons' limitations and used them anyway because no alternative existed. The tactical mathematics at Mortain seem impossible in retrospect. 12 towed guns against 200 tanks, no mobility, no armor protection, fighting blind in fog against elite SS Panzer divisions. Every calculation suggested complete destruction within the first hour. Yet Company A held for 4 hours, destroyed 14 tanks, delayed an entire German offensive at its most critical moment. This wasn't superior technology. The M5 gun was already considered obsolete by August 1944. This wasn't superior tactics. Firing at muzzle flashes violated every principle of aimed fire. This wasn't superior numbers. The Germans had overwhelming numerical advantage. What made the difference was something doctrine couldn't quantify. Crews who stayed at their guns when retreating made more sense, who fired at targets they couldn't see because doing nothing meant certain death. Modern military analysis studies Mortain for lessons about defensive operations, about using terrain, about coordinating infantry and anti-tank weapons, about the importance of observation posts like Hill 314. But the real lesson is simpler. Determined defenders with adequate weapons can achieve disproportionate results even against superior forces. The word adequate matters. The M5 gun could penetrate Panther armor. Not reliably, not consistently, but enough. Sergeant Robert Callahan returned home to Pennsylvania in 1946. He rarely spoke about Mortain. Most veterans didn't. The battle had been overshadowed by larger operations. D-Day, the Bulge, the Rhine crossing. Mortain was a footnote, a small action that had enormous strategic consequences but generated few headlines. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion was deactivated in November 1945. The unit's records were archived. Its veterans scattered across America. A few attended reunions in the 1950s and 60s, fewer each decade. By the 1980s, most were gone. The institutional memory disappeared with them. Today, a memorial stands near Mortain. It commemorates the 30th Infantry Division's defense of Hill 314. The 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion is mentioned, but the specific details of what Company A accomplished on the morning of August 7th have largely been forgotten. The fog, the blind firing, the impossible mathematics that somehow worked. The Germans called it impossible. 12 guns stopping 200 tanks. The Americans called those guns obsolete. Death traps. Not worth the logistics to maintain them. But on August 7, 1944, those obsolete guns and the men who crewed them proved that sometimes impossible just means nobody's been desperate enough to try. 37 men died doing what doctrine said couldn't be done. They fought with weapons their own army had written off. They fired blind at enemies they couldn't see. They held ground they couldn't retreat from. 14 German tanks destroyed. 4 hours that changed the course of the Normandy campaign. These men deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about gun crews who stopped Panzer divisions with courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Sergeant Callahan and the 823rd don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.